Good evening. I'm Rebecca Klassen, Associate Curator of Material Culture at the New York Historical Society. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I would like to thank our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and all of our members and other generous donors. Your support allows the New York Historical to continue to pursue our mission. The New York Historical Society is currently open on Friday, Saturday, and Sundays, so reserve your timed entry tickets on our website. Before we launch into our program, I want to let you know that it will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. We have disabled the chat function, so please do make sure to use the Q&A. After the presentation, we will get to as many questions as time allows. And with those technical notes out of the way, I'd like to thank you for tuning into our discussion of one of New York Historical's latest exhibitions, Safe Haven, Gay Life in 1950s Cherry Grove, currently on view and free to the public in our outdoor rear courtyard through October 11th. I had the immense pleasure of coordinating the show, which was curated by the dynamic trio from the Cherry Grove Archives collection, Brian Clark, Susan Kravitz, and Parker Sargent. I'm joined tonight by all three of them. Brian Clark, who first started going to Cherry Grove in 1986 and now owns a home there, has been on the Cherry Grove Archives Collection Committee since 2012, where he's been actively involved in the collection, digitization, preservation, and sharing of the archives collection. Brian also serves on the board of the Dunes Fund, which works to preserve and strengthen the Cherry Grove Dunes. He has worked as a psychotherapist in Brooklyn for the past 30 years. And Susan Kravitz is a social documentary photographer who has been photographing in Cherry Grove for the past 40 years. Her work has been widely exhibited in galleries and museums in the United States and abroad. After retiring as professor of photography and dean for arts and humanities at Nassau Community College, she went on to publish her photography book, Mascara, Mirth, and Mayhem, Independence Day on Fire Island, a collection of her July 4th Invasion of the Pines photographs taken over the past 30 years. And last but not least, Parker Sargent brings her unique perspective as a trans woman to her work documenting queer history. Parker's films The Pansy Invasion, Snap, and Grove Girls are created as love letters to the colorful and controversial community of Cherry Grove, Fire Island, which she calls home. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
The exhibition that they have curated, Safe Haven, features approximately 70 enlarged photographs from the Cherry Grove Archives collection, along with images of ephemera and other artifacts, and shares a perspective on gay history before the Stonewall Uprising of 1969 that is, for various reasons, greatly underrepresented and underexplored. Cherry Grove is a small beach town on Fire Island, which is a barrier island off the south shore of Long Island. And for the past 80 summers, it has been, like the title of the exhibition suggests, a safe haven for the LGBTQ community. So this exhibition zeroes in on the decade of the 1950s, when Cherry Grove really began to flourish as a majority gay community during a time when being gay was criminalized. We have the next slide, please. So on the lower left here, we see a rendering of the introductory area to the exhibition, which includes a map that Brian Clark very gamely illustrated. And you see that enlarged on the right. And on the upper left, we also see an aerial view of Cherry Grove depicted on a postcard from around 1952. Now, Brian, a version of this exhibition first appeared at the Stonewall National Museum and Archives in Florida, and that's a museum dedicated to LGBTQ+ history. But this iteration for the New York Historical Society, we've seen some significant changes. You all have added more sections, and we've taken more steps to provide contextualizing information to visitors who may not be familiar with gay history and culture, or even where Cherry Grove is, despite it being in New York. So one of the key introductory elements that we decided to include was that map showing Cherry Grove. Can you tell us a little bit about this map and where is Cherry Grove and how do we get there from New York City?
Sure. Hi, everyone. As Rebecca mentioned, Cherry Grove sits between the Great South Bay and the Atlantic Ocean, and it's a small hamlet. Um, Individuals would take either the Long Island Railroad, or they would hop in their car and drive to Sayville, out into Long Island, and would hop on a ferry and escape and leave behind some of the pressures, the stress, the shaming, the discrimination, and have this experience of hopping on a ferry and crossing the bay. They would arrive in Cherry Grove and land on the dock. They would transport their belongings in little wagons and walk on boardwalks. You can see that in the little map that there's no just boardwalks, no cars. And individuals would go to their homes. They may have a home with 4 or 5 other people, little cottages. And so you can see on this map, in the center, you have Duffy's Hotel. And Duffy's Hotel was a place that had a generator. And in the evenings, there would be the opportunity for couples, same-sex couples, to dance together, which was, really forbidden in mainstream America at that time. Above that, you have the community house. And the community house was originally floated over on a barge from the mainland. It was a barn. And in 1947, it was transported and put in its place. And in 1948, the Property Owners Association, along with the Arts Project, had their very first theater production. If you look in the center there to the right, you have the grocery store. Below that, you have the Monster, which in the very beginning, the Monster was a guest house and went on over the decades to become, an infamous disco and restaurant, and also had famous locations in Key West and in Manhattan. Closer to the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean there, you see Pat's Restaurant. And Pat's Restaurant was significant in that they welcomed gay people. And that may not seem like such a big deal today, but in 1950s America, that was pretty profound. And so you also have on the other side, you have a Sea Shack. And so basically that's kind of the overview. It was a very kind of small little town. The houses had no electricity. You had to use a pump to get water. To heat your shower, they had tanks on the top of homes. So there was an intimacy that also got created, not just by the isolation of being cut off from the mainland, but also the seclusion of people. There was an intimacy and a quietness within the homes, and people, when they would come together, they would go down to Duffy's bar and be able to come together. So that's basically the overall for the map, and gives people an idea of who we are.
Yeah, I love this idea of intimacy. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So this image of the Cherry Grove dock, which you kind of could see in the aerial view with the postcard, is reproduced as a large mural banner on 76th Street, right outside the exhibition. So it really greets visitors before they even step into the exhibition space. And I love that you can kind of see everyone gathered together, and you get to look more closely and you see their faces. I love the guy in the water in the corner there. But Brian, so why did the curators choose this image as a welcome, and what does it tell us about Cherry Grove during the 1950s? Not just the physical setting, but the community there and its development.
Yeah, I think one of the things about this photograph is that all these people have come out probably to take a photograph, and you see children, you see gay people, you see straight people. This was a time of transition where more and more gay people were coming to Cherry Grove. Those people that were not happy with that, over time, may have stopped coming to Cherry Grove, but those who remained began to develop connections and relationships. They participated in organizations, on boards, on the fire department, in the theater. They performed. So there was this very profound experience in 1950s Cherry Groves where people, were coming together, gay and straight people, and that was something very unique in that era in 1950s America.
Now let's take a look at the first slide, the next slide, sorry. The next slide. And so this is the image that comes first in the exhibition. So it was selected as a sort of a mood and tone setter. Susan, why did the team choose this photo?
I think we chose this photo because, excuse me, here is a young man who's very beautiful and who's seductive, who is very confident but casual in his pose. Something, characteristics of which you would not expect if you thought about what a gay person would look like in the 1950s. The stereotypes of gay people where they were harassed, they were persecuted, they were hiding in their closets. He's not hiding in anybody's closet. And in fact, he's a weekend guest at Hot House. So it's like a little double entendre. He's a hot man in a hot house. And he's a visitor, just the way we are all coming to this exhibition to be visitors. So I like that he was a visitor. I like that we're visitors seeing the show. And I like the way the photograph is designed, where there is a lot of empty space to walk in. So we can walk into the exhibit, we can walk into this young man's life. And also, he's looking at us while we're looking at him. And there was something about that. You can see that he's looking out, but he's looking within himself, but we're looking at him. And all these put together sort of gave us a lot of vibrancy to the photograph, and hoping that you would look at it and want to move on and see what else we have that will entice you to enjoy 1950s Cherry Grove.
Well, so something that you alluded to is, perceptions of the 1950s, our present day perceptions of gay life in the 1950s United States, and how this material really sort of upends these preconceived ideas or these received ideas. So can you tell me a little bit about how this show developed and what prompted the theme of 1950s?
Well, I can thank Brian for showing me some of the most amazing photographs when I first joined the archives. And being a photographer, I was amazed that this was 1950, because in the 1950s, most people were taking snapshots. They were very casual, they were out of focus, they were not framed beautifully. But a lot of the photographs that we were looking at were very beautiful photographs that were well composed and spoke eloquently about the community at that time. And I just thought that this would make a wonderful exhibition for people to see what they really didn't know about homosexuality in the 1950s and what it was like in Cherry Grove particularly, which was a community full of freedom of expression. People were happy. If you look at these photographs, they're joyful. That was opening a window into a community that most people knew nothing about or had stereotyped ideas about it, what should be like. And so we looked at more and more of these photographs and decided this would make a terrific show. And it has.
Yeah, could we look at the next slide, please? So this first section of the exhibition, which is simply titled 1950s Cherry Grove, lays out some of those key themes of the exhibition. So Brian, I know that 3 Men and a Dog is one of your favorites. What is it that you like about this image, and what does it say about the time?
Right. What I love about this picture is that these men seem very happy. To say, let's continue with what Sue was saying. There was a joy. These people were out, open, and they had this space, this tiny space, possibly just for a weekend, but they were able to come here and be joyful and have connections. These individuals appear, we don't know, but they appear to be certainly friends. They're having that experience of community that was so impossible, so unable to be found in mainstream America because of all the laws and the restrictions and the consequences, the persecution. So here you have these three individuals that look to me pretty gay, and I think they're having this opportunity to explore an identity, to explore connection to other people, and to do this in the light of day, which was so dangerous to do elsewhere. So, and I love that maybe it's their dog, or I love that, because it says something about connection and family, and dare I say, normality, if you will. That guess what? Gay people are just like every other. So I think I like that too. The normalcy of it all.
Right, and so Kay Guinness, who we see on the right with Patricia Fitzgerald, seated together on the beach. She was such a fascinating figure, and she appears in many of the photographs that are held by the archives. So, what can we say about this image of her, and what people sought when they went to Cherry Grove?
Well, here are two women very close together, sitting on the beach, having apparently a wonderful time. And what's noticeable for us is the proximity they have to each other, which was forbidden in mainland America. But here they were free to be able to sit as close as they wanted to, and to be enjoying the beautiful ocean in front of them. And by the way, we had the most beautiful beach in Cherry Grove. So you'd love to be sitting there watching the ocean. And it's just a very comfortable photograph. The colors in the photograph make you feel as though it's from the 1950s. I think that adds to the pleasure of it. But Kay Guinness was quite a character. And we have a lot of her photographs because she actually compiled an album, which she handed down to a variety of people who ended up with Gay Nathan and Julie Paradise, who donated the photographs in there to us. So that's why we have so many pictures of Kay. But you probably want to know that she was quite a seductive woman and had many lovers, despite the fact that she had been married a few times. But she had arrangements with her husbands where they would go to their golf club and she would go to Cherry Grove. And I can tell you a quick story about her. She broke up with one of her lovers and wanted to get out of that house right away. So she called up a local fisherman whose shack she knew was for sale. And she said, "Is that shack still for sale?" And he said, "Yes." She said, "I'm moving in tonight." She packed her bag, walked across to the east end of Cherry Grove, which was not very developed. And that's where she stayed. And she called it No Man's Land.
I love that. That's awesome. Well, so, I think the personal stories really add so much to our understanding of what life was like. And there's a fantastic audio guide that uses the Cherry Grove Archives oral history collection. So let's listen to the stop that accompanies this photo, which is more about people's reasons for going. And, we may have a little bit of technical difficulty in terms of the volume. So if you could listen in a little bit closely, that would be.
Like many gay people, Audrey Hartman discovered Cherry Grove while visiting a neighboring community on Fire Island. Taking the 4-mile walk from Ocean Beach with friends to enjoy the nightlife in the Grove, she knew she found a place where she could feel free to be herself.
Well, I was going around with a crowd, a group of women. Out of the 6 of them, 3 were gay and 3 weren't. And my sister was one of them, my twin sister, who wasn't gay. And we were staying at Ocean Bay Park. We would come down, walk along the beach. It was an escape for everyone to be able to come out here on the weekend and be yourself. It was a safe haven. I could say to someone, hi, I'm Audrey Hartman. I live in this city or whatever, and then say, and I'm gay.
Parker, so you were the force behind the compilation of this audio guide. Can you speak a little bit about the Oral History Project and your process of selecting?
Sure. When I joined the archive, that was kind of my skill. What is, as a filmmaker, is to kind of just take on the process of reaching out to some of our senior community members and capture their stories. And that especially became relevant when we got into this exhibit, because as Sue said, Brian and Sue were going through all these photographs and finding these real treasures, but of people we really don't know, and an environment that none of us lived in. And so being able to get, put these photos into context from community members that could tell us what it was like in the community back then, living with straight people, and whether they liked us or whether they left, and what their experiences were being persecuted in the raids, or just the joy, as Audrey said, of being out and being able to say, I'm gay and I'm amongst other gay people. And you don't get that in the city. We had gay bars in the city, but remember, they are dark, tiny little places where you are always just a wall away from danger. The police could break in at any moment and arrest you. And as we know, ruin your life in a sense. And you took that chance just going into a bar in New York City. And of course they were run by mobsters. But out in Cherry Grove, you were out in nature and you were free. And while there were still restrictions, there was definitely a lot more room for Kay Guinness and her lover to sit on the beach and touch each other, for these gay men to wear that scarf around his neck like he couldn't in the city. And so when we hear these stories from our community members that were there in the 50s, again, it gives these pictures context. But for me personally, it gives me such an idea of like, these people are the same as us now. We always feel like Stonewall was the beginning of gay life, that was the beginning of gay rights and gay community, but they were really coming together in the 50s and formulating communities in ways that they couldn't there. And I feel like that probably rolled over into bringing that back to regular life, and then eventually Stonewall.
There's a siren going on outside of my window. I'm so sorry. Just to pause for a second. The hazards of city life, right? But could we go on to the next slide, please?
Like many gay people, Audrey Hartman discovered.
Okay, so the photographs that are included in this exhibition, are not just interesting from a rarity standpoint, and interesting in terms of as a survival of pre-Stonewall gay history, but they're really interesting from an aesthetic quality as well. And Susan, this is among your favorites. Can you say a little bit of why?
I can try. These photographs were never meant to be on exhibit. They were really snapshots that were taken during the course of parties or theater or just daily activities in Cherry Grove, one of which was a brunch at B. Greer's home. And these two people were standing out in front. And I've looked at this photograph so many times to try and understand what it is about it that makes me always want to go back and look at it again. And it's the mystery of the photograph, I think, that is so appealing to me. I mean, I can talk to you about the formal elements of the photograph, the way you can talk about a piece of art, the way the line falls and creates tension in the photograph. But the tones, there's a very large range of tones in a black and white photograph, and this photograph captures many of them. The way the shapes complement each other in the center, but that almost contradict each other on the sides. There's a lot that's going on in an artistic sense that makes it an interesting photograph to look at. But really, what I'm trying to put into words is the fact that it's a photograph of an everyday scene in front of a house in Cherry Grove, but it's also a photograph of fantasy. So we have reality and fantasy butting up against each other in the same photograph. And here is a young man dressed in appears to be an overcoat with white gloves, which looks like he's wearing his mother's or his grandmother's hat. And he's holding his cup of apparently what we think is tea. And he has his black boa, but next to him is a friend, I assume, who is dressed up in a variety of drag that includes a veil, flowered hat, and a dress, also holding a cup of tea with his ID bracelet on. And these are figures that you wouldn't run across on the streets of Manhattan, but they are everyday people. And this is a photograph, a photograph of everyday people in ordinary life who are fantastical, if I can make that word up, because they are so rare to find people like this who have unusual expressions. I mean, who is he looking at? Who is he staring at? I really can't get beyond his white gloves. That's the best part of it to me. But anyway, this is one of the photographs in the show, and it has a lot of depth to it. It has negative space to make you look into the center. You know, there's a lot of things to make you think about while you think about gay life in Cherry Grove. And the fact that you can come to Cherry Grove, you can put on costumes, and you can shed that life you had in New York that was often penalized, that was persecuted, and you could have fun and you could enjoy the freedom of being in Cherry Grove. And that's one of the things that attracts me to this.
Yeah, that's a good segue into our next slide. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so party life and that fantastical living, you know, is the largest section of this exhibition. And I mean, honestly, if I had the fortune of experiencing some of these, you know, fabulous looking parties, I probably would have, you know, left a huge photographic record of it too. But Parker, what is it about parties in 1950s Cherry Grove, you know, that is so significant to the history and culture?
Well, I think especially when we're looking at these photographs, we're seeing a huge element of the parties in Cherry Grove, which is drag. And just the idea of playing with gender, because people weren't just coming out to sort of discover their sexuality, but kind of go against the stereotypical ideas of male and female that were existing in the regular world. So you see men in drag, but you also see women in drag. And also just costume play. There's so much tongue-in-cheek costuming going on, because you have people from the city that had these wonderful jobs in the theater, whether they were costumers or stage production people. Even in this picture here, Ed Burke in Ethel Merman's costume. You know, what is he doing in Ethel Merman's costume? Well, because he probably worked with Ethel Merman and said, can I take this to a great party I'm having this weekend in Cherry Grove? And so it's scandalous for this time period. We look at this, especially in a time of RuPaul's Drag Race, where we very much have an idea of drag and what drag is. But back then, it was still illegal for a man to dress as a woman. And so for these men, even just a kimono, you know, it was feminizing in a way. And he was, you know, the little parasol, and of course, his friend with the short dress, but the little, what do you call that, garter belt. It's all very playful. And again, as playful as it is, it's really powerful. It's really powerful that these people have this freedom to do that, where they could otherwise be arrested. And Cherry Grove became this celebratory kind of place. So these parties, I think, were key in people socializing with each other in a very comfortable way. Again, out in the sun, outside, and just being comfortable and free to be gay.
Right, right. And, you know, and to kind of pick up on what you were saying about, you know, not everyone being on board with drag. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So this is a notice that was published by the Arts Project of Cherry Grove, which is one of the main organizations. And it's about drag. And so it says, there is a start of a serious situation in Cherry Grove, which we must all help eliminate immediately. It is growing so rapidly that for our own safeguard, we feel it necessary to issue this bulletin. We refer to the matter of drag, which has gotten out of hand. And it goes on, it gives examples, but then it says it is against the law of the state of New York to wear such costumes, which might tend to offend our neighbors. For our own sake, we must keep costume parties and private dress-up affairs within the bounds of accepted propriety, or better, eliminate them entirely. Let's discourage further criticism. Let's police ourselves. Let's keep our island the way we know and love it. So Brian, what is up with the conflict between this, that's really clearly in this sternly worded, notice, issued by one of these big main organizations?
Well, I have to say to begin with that the Arts Project of Cherry Grove has been a strong force for 70 years, and has stood alongside the LGBTQ community. But, it was 1950s, and there were some on the board that probably had ambivalence and wanted to maintain what they considered decent behavior. So you have this sign that comes out by the Arts Project, but I think it was a changing time, and there was ambivalence. So.
Yeah, and let's go on to the next slide, which kind of opens up some of this idea of the stakes, the very real stakes, that the consequences that people could face for, being gay. So, and while the show underlines this idea of Cherry Grove as a safe haven, here are a couple of news clippings that discuss, gay men who were arrested. So Brian, can you tell us a little bit about how police operate in Cherry Grove and some of these repercussions?
Sure. I think there was elements to the community that wanted to maintain a certain sensibility. And so what would happen during the 1950s and the 1960s is that kind of pretty regularly, the police would come over and they would try to arrest as many gay men as possible, anywhere from 10 to 30. They would handcuff them. They would transport them over in little boats over to the mainland and book them and then keep them in jail until they were able to post bail. And you have this ambivalence with a community that while it was infinitely more safe than the mainland, there were risks. And in addition, that young groups of men would come over and try to beat up the gay men. So even though it was so much safer, there were still problems, and I think it speaks to the importance of incorporating a sexual self into one's identity, because even against these risks where they would do everything to try to ruin your reputation by putting their names in the paper, by listing their places of employment, these people were still resilient and wanted to have this whole self and express that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good, can we go to the next slide, please? So this is fundamentally about expression, right? So, and it's a new section for the exhibition at the New York Historical Society. And so why did the curatorial team feel that this section with the heading of sexuality was so important to include?
I know that one of the things that we learned from our exhibition in Stonewall is that we heard from lots of men who said, I came there for the sex. There was such a forbiddenness around being identified as gay, but also expressing, whether it be touching someone, holding someone's hand, or even showing some kind of sexual attraction. So here in Cherry Grove, you see these, to me, very beautiful pictures of men and women being able to show that part of themselves.
Right. Can we see the next slide? I think that really, yes. So this is an image that, is pretty tame by today's standards, right? But it's also pretty saucy. And it's one that a lot of people react to. So, Brian, Susan, Parker, what is it about this that makes it such a provocative and interesting photograph?
Can I just say before that I think, we really wanted sexuality to stand on its own. We wanted it to not be in hiding. We wanted it to be out and for people to be able to see that that was an important part of the community. So,
which, by the way, was very hard to capture on film because people didn't want to be identified in a photograph. Not that they were having sex, but the inclination was, oh yes, maybe they're fooling around, or at least one. And the two women in the previous photograph, one was sitting on another's lap. It was so rare to find a photograph like that actually said, look, these two women must be lovers. Or the men on the beach who were openly, kidding around with each other on the beach, but indicating that they were being free about their sexuality. That's very rare to find, even though it doesn't look like a big deal to us right now. It was very unusual, as is this photograph, where you can see how seductive each young man is to the other. And I'd like to point out the man sitting on the bench who's watching all this too. So I think it's unusual, and it's hard to depict sexuality without having pornography involved. But it's a naive sexuality in the 1950s, in photographs, but it's very indicative of the kinds of attractions that were going on in Cherry Grove at that time.
And it was like Brian said, it was a main part of why a lot of people went there. But I think, maybe they came for the sex and they stayed for the community, because again, we have these environments where we have an area called the meat rack, which has been there since the 50s, and men would cruise there and have sex in the bushes and things like that. And I think maybe still do. But this is not, it's not dark, it's not seedy, it's not pornographic. It is, like you said, a picture that we hear a lot from. A lot of people tell us, oh, I love that picture with the guy and you can see his butt crack. I think living in a world of pornography where everything is porn, our pop stars are porn, our commercials are porn, I think we maybe become desensitized. And I think seeing something like this that has a touch of sexuality to it, but the intimacy, I think that's really what people are responding to, because again, we have this really unconscious idea of what gay people were prior to Stonewall. And I think this shows, whether it's sexuality, you may even read love into it. And I think that maybe is what touches people.
Right. We just have a few more slides to go through, but the next slide, please. Is about that kind of staying for the community, right? So it's a section that explores the role of theater, as we mentioned before, in the history of Cherry Grove, and in fact, the importance of Cherry Grove's theater in U.S. history was recognized with a listing on the National Register of Historic Places in 2013. And so there are so many images of its productions that really could have been featured. Susan, how did you go about selecting the photos? And if Brian could then follow with what theater offered to the Cherry Grove community.
It was very difficult because there were many, there were renditions of different shows. There were rehearsals, there were the actual shows. There was the 8 o'clock show, there was the 10 o'clock show. Many of the shows had the same name year after year. But we selected the ones where we thought you, as the viewer, could get a very good idea about what camp was like in the skits that they put on, because camp was not allowed on Broadway or in mainstream America the way it was in Cherry Grove. So even the way in the left photograph in the USO skit, each of the characters on stage has their own version of drag. That's really pretty funny. I'm especially attracted to the young man on the right who's on his toes. He must be quite a talented person and a ballet dancer, perhaps, who knows. But I think it was such an important part of Cherry Grove from the very beginning, because the theater people were some of the first to come out, and they told other theater people who came out, and there was a whole range of people. There were the producers, the directors, there were the costume designers. We even had an orchestra pit in the community house back in the late 40s and the 50s. It was quite a production. People came out every weekend to see these shows, which in and of itself formed a community that was making it very vibrant for people who came there. I know when I went to Cherry Grove and I saw these theater productions, I was amazed at how people came together and were so thrilled to be together in the community house watching the shows. And it said so much about Cherry Grove itself, in addition to the productions that were put on. So I think these shows were just very valuable in the formation of who people in Cherry Grove really were and what the community ended up being.
I think we have to move on to the next slide. Sorry, Brian. But this is also about continuing this idea of community. And Brian, you had mentioned some of these spaces at the start of this presentation, Duffy's Hotel and Pat's Restaurant that are in the map. But so yeah, this idea of community is very central, and this is in a section called Coming Together. Susan, how do these images show this kind of specialness of the community? How does it communicate that?
And people may not know this, but gay people were not allowed to congregate, nor were they allowed to be served alcohol in a public bar until the late 1960s. So, but they can come to Cherry Grove and they can all say, let's meet at Duffy's. The photograph on the left was taken at Duffy's Hotel, a place where Kay Guinness, who's sitting in the foreground, thought was her second home. And they loved to go there in the evenings. There you could get some food, you could have lots to drink, and later on, when Duffy wasn't looking, you could have same-sex dancing. And on the right is Pat's Restaurant, where you could be together in the open, you could be gay. That was not an opportunity afforded to people who were gay in the 1950s. So you can only imagine, if you put yourself in their shoes, how exciting it was to be able to hang with people who understood you and respected you in a community that did not exist in mainstream America at any other time until we go past Stonewall and begin to understand the movement that asked for equality and gay rights.
Can we go to the next slide? This is the final slide. And it's the final section of the exhibition. And it's also new to the NYHS presentation. And so it discusses some of the significant changes that Cherry Grove has seen since the 1950s. Parker, so what are some of the themes that it touches upon, and why did the curatorial team feel it was necessary to include them?
Well, I think, having this exhibit in the New York Historical Society, we knew we were going to reach a much larger audience than just we would at Stonewall. As you kind of said earlier, that's an LGBTQ audience. Thankfully to you guys, we're going to reach a lot more people from all over the world. And so when Brian earlier mentioned how we kind of rethought adding sexuality, because he had heard a lot from people at the previous showing that sexuality was a big aspect for me as a trans woman, I wanted people to know that today Cherry Grove is still a safe haven. And all those decades that followed, we have to be honest when we're looking at the photos and say, we're seeing mostly white faces and mostly male white faces from the 1950s. And that's just the reality of the world that was at that time. And Cherry Grove, just like the rest of the world, changed, but it always remained a place where people felt like if they were disenfranchised in the real world, a lot of them could find a home and acceptance in Cherry Grove. And so that includes trans people, people of color. We have a large nudist colony community. So it's really a place where people, over time, they started it in the 1950s. They really laid the groundwork for us. And we really feel proud to honor them, all those men and women. And there's so many that came after them because of the hard work that they did. And we all get to reap the benefits of it now.
Love that. So let's just move on to some of the questions. And a couple of them have to do with the people in the photos. So one person asked, is anyone in the archives collection still in touch with those who are still living? How have their lives changed in subsequent decades, and how are they doing today? And somebody asked a similar set of questions. Have any members of the public who have seen the exhibition identified otherwise unknown people, or perhaps provided backstory about any of the photos?
One of the most wonderful interviews was with a woman named Sherilyn Urso, and she was a waitress in Pat's Restaurant in the 1940s. And she had told us some wonderful stories about the raids and her being threatened to have acid thrown in her face. But she was also on our stage, and she donated some wonderful images to our archive. So she's one person.
And then the niece, actually, of was it the niece, Brian and Sue,
Yes.
of Duffy's?
Yes.
She grew up there. She grew up sitting on the bar, at the end of the bar, drinking her Shirley Temple. And she came to the exhibit and was telling us, just like seeing these photos, how exciting it was. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, most of the people in these photos are not with us. As far as we know, we have little tricklings of people kind of telling us, oh, I remember such and such, but we haven't been able to identify most of them. We know the people largely in Kay Guinness's photos because they're from her photo album and everything's kind of referenced. But a lot of this is just photo albums that were donated over time that Brian and Sue so lovingly, take the old photos out and scan them and retouch them. And so we're handling stuff that is really rare. And we find it so exciting when we do find out more about people in the photos. And so if anybody knows anything, tell us more.
We want more.
But we do know some things about some of the people who love to go to Cherry Grove, right? And so one of the questions, says, you mentioned there being theater folk in Cherry Grove. I believe the poet W.H. Auden and his partner were residents a little earlier in the 1940s. Can you talk a little bit about the type of people who came to Cherry Grove? Was there a vibrant artistic community, for example?
Well, we have Truman Capote, Christopher Isherwood, Patricia Hyde-Smith. I think even Marilyn Monroe made her way to Cherry Grove. So there's a lot of history with celebrities, dancers, artists that were attracted to Cherry Grove because of the creative, maybe more liberal sensibilities. So.
And W.H. Auden wrote a poem called Pleasure Island, which is the story of Cherry Grove. So he's left his memories with us.
Yeah, I feel like there's a study yet to be written, a scholarly book yet to be penned about the influence of creative culture in Cherry Grove and on national creative culture and history.
Audrey Hartman, who's one of the people that is in the audio tour, who was in Cherry Grove in the 1950s, she talks about having a party and inviting over Tennessee Williams because he was visiting one of her friends. And while she was excited to have Tennessee Williams at her party, she was nervous that, oh gosh, what if this appears in papers back in New York? What could that do for him? So there were definitely a lot of writers, gay writers especially, who came to Cherry Grove and probably found a lot of inspiration and wrote about that kind of community, taking out the gayness, unfortunately, a lot of times when they would write for the public world. But inspired by Cherry Grove.
And then another question is, in addition to Cherry Grove, do similar archives / compiled historical narratives exist for other LGBTQ plus havens like the Pines? I guess we'd have to ask the Pines, but.
well, the Pines does have, they have the Pines Fire Island Historical Society. And we, you know, of course, we're all friendly with each other because we're very small. Fire Island is a strip of land that is 15 different communities, and only 2 of them are gay. It's very well known as like a gay haven, but only 2 of them are gay, and it's the Pines and Cherry Grove. We're right next to each other. And we share a lot of history, but we're very different in a lot of ways. We are a much campier community. They came later as almost as a response to Cherry Grove to say, we don't want that here. So we have very different histories, although we share it. I think for us, and this is because of Brian and Susan and our chairperson, Troy Files, and Lee Sharmat, who is our cataloger, you know, we've done a lot of work since we inherited the archive a few years ago. And we all work really well together. We're community friends. So no matter where we are, we're kind of always talking about the archive. And we've done a lot of work, I think maybe more than most of the other communities in Cherry Grove, but Fire Island, but they all have a very rich history, yes.
And then we have one final question. So in 2021 America, do you think places like Cherry Grove continue to hold their resonance and significance to the LGBTQ plus community, especially now that the LGBTQ plus community is much more widely accepted? That's a big one.
That's a great question. I think it does. I think it's an important place. I think people still, as Parker and Sue have said, you know, it's still a place where people need to have a safe place. We hope that while we hope it will continue, we want to continue to welcome all people. So that I think is a foundation of Cherry Grove.
And I run into this question a lot in the documentaries that I've made. Like, do we still need Cherry Grove as gay people? Because can't we be gay everywhere? And I think maybe that is true for privileged white gay men, which I don't even really believe. I still think they need Cherry Grove, but maybe they can feel more welcome into the entire world. But I definitely think that women, people of color, and trans women like myself, we still need this space. We are still outsiders in mainstream America, and the ability to come to this space and feel comfortable and feel safe, and that is a rarity when you're someone like myself, that you can feel safe. And this is the safest place I've ever felt in my life. So I think it's imperative that this space, while we still have lots of straight community members that we love, and it's important that it still remain a queer space.
And I just want to add one more thing, that the people in Cherry Grove are very special. And what I really appreciate even today is their creativity and their wildly imaginative minds that come up with the most amazing drag or costumes or performances that I can't find in any place else. So it is a place where there's a sense of belonging, yes, and it's a safety, but for me, it's the creativity that is always so amazing to me, and how much I love being there because of that.
And so many people talk about the ferry ride, you know, being this shedding, you know, this kind of that part of the here, you know, the journey. And maybe once that ferry ride, when people no longer have that feeling, is when Cherry Grove is no longer needed. I don't know. Just a thought.
Never gonna happen.
All right. So we've unfortunately run out of time. But to the attendees, you know, we look forward to seeing you back here on Wednesday, July 9th for the next episode of Curator Confidential, which is called Explore Our New Acquisition, Nurse Tracy. And that's with artist Tim Okamura and Wendy Ikemoto, who is curator of American art at the New York Historical Society. So thank you all and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.